fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on KCW 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm sitting here with Mr. David Rose Martino.
That's my new name, right?
Yeah, I'm telling you, we're sticking with that. I like
You're
it.
sticking with that? Okay.
It sounds nice. It sounds pleasant. It doesn't sound serial
actually,
killer. Yeah. It doesn't sound mean. You know, and everyone knows how rough you are. So it's you know,
yes,
it softens up the mean guy.
Yeah.
Hey, and you're putting up all those new reviews.
Yeah, I have two more up, Black Widow and A Quiet Place Part 2.
You know, I've never seen A Quiet Place Part 1. I've heard her...
Oh, that's very good.
Yeah, I've heard that, and I've heard her talk about it in interviews, but I've never... I don't know why I missed it. Was that during the pandemic? Was that it or something?
I think that was before.
Oh.
I think. I can't remember.
I'm getting too old. I
don't know. I'm losing my mind, too.
Was it pre or after or during, you know?
I'd have to look it up.
Yeah, so that's crazy, because I don't remember it. I remember the name of the movie. Didn't it win Best Picture or up for Best Picture or something?
Yeah, I think it was, now that I think about it, I think it was like, what was it, 2018?
Yeah.
I think it was 2018, so it was before the pandemic, I believe.
Jeez, I was only a kid then.
Me too.
Now I'm old. Boy, I'll tell you, what happened? Okay, now let's get into the serious stuff here today. This is the important stuff. We got another author. Now she is from Rattling Good Yarns Press, or she's not from there, but she is publishing through them. And so her new book, which came out on June 1st, is Infraction, and the author is our guest, Yvonne Zipter. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Well, we'll see if you say that at the end of the show. Might not be. No, hey, listen, this is great. It's great to have you. And we don't know much about you. You know, you're kind of a newbie for us. So tell us a little bit about your history. Let the listeners know who you are and when did the writing start for you?
Well, I started writing really bad poetry in high school. I didn't start getting serious about it until after college. My first collection of poems was published in 1990, and then in the middle of that, or just before that was published, I started writing a column for the gay press. It was syndicated at a bunch of places around the country. It was basically a humor column about lesbian life. And then some of those essays got collected into a book called Ransacking the Closet. And actually my first book was Diamonds Are a Dyke's Best Friend, about the role of softball in the lesbian community. That book wasn't... I had hoped to make it a little more scholarly and in-depth, but my publisher wanted something that would have a broad appeal. And I thought, okay, well, you know, this is a start. This is the first book on this. Somebody will come along eventually and write, you know, something else that's more in-depth and whatnot. And nobody ever did. So it sort of stands as a classic, unfortunately now out of print, but so those were my first few books, and then I just had a collection of poems called Kissing the Long Face of the Greyhound come out last summer, and the novel is the first long fiction that I've had published. I've had a few short stories published, but I'm not a great fan of short stories. I like to really dig into a piece of fiction, so I read a lot of novels, and well, that's the basic history. I could give you more detail about how I got into this particular novel, but I'll let you ask some more questions.
Well, yeah, no, I was just wondering. So it's always fascinating to find out the history of a writer. So when you say you were writing in school, but it was bad, or you considered it bad, and you weren't serious until college, what was the difference? Like, what made you go from what you considered bad to go, well, I'm going to write serious stuff? What was there a catalyst or something that made you want to go to be a more serious writer?
Well, I think in high school I didn't have a great deal of exposure to poetry, and it was all kind of what I was writing was very schmaltzy and abstract, and just not especially polished. And then in college, I took pretty much the only creative writing class I had. I was not an English major. I took a creative writing class, and we, started out studying Sylvia Plath, and I was just stunned by the use of language in her poems, and that's what really got me inspired. And from that point on, I just started reading poetry voraciously and just learned how to write from reading and practicing and trying to get better.
Okay, so going from poetry into a novel or a fiction, that's a bit of a change. What was the thing that made you kind of go into a novel or a full story rather than just poetry?
Yeah, I had been wanting to write a novel for a long time, and I probably tried 2 or 3 times, but I didn't really have a good sense of what I was doing or what I wanted the plot to be, and they all kind of just died after a few pages. And then I retired in 2018 as a manuscript editor at the University of Chicago Press, and when I was working in the journals division there, I edited, among other journals, a journal called Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, and one of their regular features was they published archival material, things that hadn't been published anywhere before. In this particular issue that I edited, there was an archive of notes taken by a gynecologist in late 19th century Russia about 3 lesbians that he had been treating. And one was a Jewish woman, one was a prostitute, and then one was from the landed gentry. And all of the stories were interesting, but it was that last one, the woman from the landed gentry, just grabbed me. It was just such a good, interesting story, and I thought immediately this would make a great novel. And then I spent about 2 years trying to convince trying to convince myself that I couldn't write this because I didn't have any background in Russian or Russian history, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then I jumped into 2 years of just doing research so I could bring myself up to speed a little bit. So it was a slow process, but even during times when work and other things interrupted, and I wouldn't look at it for a year or two, I'd come back to it and be just as excited about it as I was before. So I felt like I was onto something.
Well, that's pretty interesting. I was just like, so when you wrote this book, Infraction, what was the thought behind it? Like, what got you into the story?
Well, I don't want to give any spoilers, but
No.
The gynecologist, he went into a lot of detail about, it was actually the partner of the woman he was working with that he ended up spending the most time writing about. And he went into a lot of detail about her childhood and her time at, after her mother died, being sent away to boarding school in St. Petersburg, and just kind of the whole story of her life. And I thought it was amazing, and I thought other people need to know about this, and it was kind of my mission to put it in a format that other people could easily access. I ended up taking a 12-page document and turning it into about 300 pages, so I did add a few details along the way.
How do you decide when you do a historical fiction, so you're taking kind of real people, real characters, and real kind of real areas and sometimes real events, how do you decide what you're going to use and what you're going to fictionalize?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the key things that I changed, I'm trying to think back now to when I was working on all of this, the main character, the women were not identified by name. They were identified by initials, and I gave them names. But Marya, the main character, was described as basically a stone butch. Like, she liked to sexually arouse her partner, but she didn't want to be touched. And I thought, I didn't really know how to write about that because it's not part of my experience. And so I made their relationship very mutual.
Did you find any particular challenges writing a historical novel that takes place in 19th century Russia?
Yeah, that was part of why it took me so long to write to start writing, is because I thought, I don't really have a sense of how these people would talk. And so I spent a lot of time reading, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky just to kind of get a flavor for how they would speak. And in early drafts, I went really formal with their speech. Like, I didn't use any contractions at all. And then I went through a class on writing a novel proposal, and the instructor was like, yeah, this is too stilted. You need to put some contractions in here. So, that kind of evolved. But yeah, it was just trying to get into the head of people from a time and place I didn't know at all. Things that we take for granted just weren't known to them at all. And that's, again, where my research came in handy. I just read a lot.
It's really interesting, but so when you take a story that's set in a different time in a different country, was there something that you wanted to get across? Is there sort of subtext, or is there something that you wanted people to take away from this other than the surface story?
Yeah, I think it's, in some ways, it's kind of timeless, and basically the message is you need to be honest about who you are, and true to yourself, because that dishonesty by not fully disclosing things plays a key role in how events unfold in the novel. And I expect, I don't know that that's entirely translatable, what happens in the novel to, to present day, but the basic idea of you need to be upfront about who you are and circumstances so that things don't get messed up along the way.
Well, we can certainly try.
Yeah.
Doesn't always go as planned. So when you go through a story and you're doing that research and you're kind of going into the history, were there things that kind of surprised you about that time and place?
Gosh, I mean, it was all so new to me, but there were definitely things that I focused on. I focused on the culture at that time of things like opera and dance and that kind of stuff, and the food. I knew that I was going to have food come up a lot in the novel, because I'm a big fan of food. And I worked in a couple of dogs along the way, so that was one of the things that was interesting to me as I was going through this. There were pieces where I just couldn't find a lot of information already published, like, did people in St. Petersburg at that time actually have dogs? And I would reach out to scholars who were completely unknown to me, but I saw that they had done some research on, a topic that touched on something I needed to know about, and I would write to them and ask them these questions, and they were just so generous. They would write back and, lead me to sources and give me basic information. It was a pretty great experience.
I wonder, so how did the gay and lesbian people live or meet each other back then? I mean, there wasn't phone apps and stuff, and there probably wasn't really any big gay districts of town, I would imagine. What was kind of the means of people kind of meeting up?
Well, part of what was complicated about this is very little is known about lesbians at that time. There are almost no sources that touch on that at all. So I kind of had to imagine that part myself. On the other hand, a gay male culture is well documented, and a lot of it was just fascinating to me about how these guys found each other. And it was at the baths, at the Cinzanelli circus. There was a thing with wearing a red tie was supposed to signal to other people. There were specific restaurants where, like, Tchaikovsky and people, well-known gays, would go. So I ended up adding a minor character who was gay, just so I could talk about this stuff, because I thought it was fascinating. But the women, I don't know, it was just kind of by chance, I think, through boarding school. And then a large part of the novel has to do with a series of lectures called the Allerchine courses. And this was kind of like something that the government devised to placate women who were not allowed to pursue higher education at that time. So they just gave them these random lectures, and there were people from all different classes of society. And then often they would also meet after these lectures to talk about securing more rights for women. And so I think through those, the Allerchine courses and the political meetings and whatnot, they could sort of find each other that way.
Yeah, it's interesting that the challenges that people went through in different times, different places, and how I think a lot of it's taken for granted now.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and certainly, the famous gay men were famous. They were like princes and wealthy people, and they could get away with stuff that probably your average guy couldn't.
Yeah, I would imagine, if you've got some sort of family or power that you're able to skirt around it.
Yeah.
No pun intended.
Yeah.
How do you develop characters? Like, so you took the initials and stuff, and you made them into people. So, like Myra, how would you decide what personality and what style and how they would act and react? Do you sort of like see this in your head and do you sort of develop it, or do you take a character or someone you kind of know already and build off of that? Like, how does it work for you?
For Marya, she was she was pretty well described in the archive as being very opinionated, extremely intelligent, basically not putting up with nonsense from anyone, and so she was easy to kind of develop. She's certainly not based on me because I am I am not a strong, pushy personality. But given that kind of framework, it was easy to develop her. Vera, the other character, the love interest, it was a little more challenging. And then, like they live with Marya's maiden aunt, and she kind of represents the old school of thinking about how society should be run, and just kind of old-fashioned. So they develop that way. The men in the book, I had read a number of books of correspondence between men at that time, and they wrote and I don't even mean like gay men, but men writing to other men, wrote in this really flowery and affectionate style, and I was really taken with that. And so all of the male characters appear as letter writers for the most part.
Now, I was wondering, when you create character, do you have an inner monologue in your head? Do you hear the characters? I know I hear voices.
Yeah.
I was wondering, is it an inner monologue? Are you translating images or symbols, or how does that work for you?
That's a tough one. They evolved over time as I got to know who they were better and how they were interacting with each other. But yeah, that was definitely, as I kind of alluded earlier, something I struggled with a bit, to give them distinct voices. And I'm not sure. That's in part why a couple of the characters are written in third person, because I wasn't able to get a handle enough on how they would talk beyond little bits of dialogue here and there. And I lost my train of thought. But anyway, yeah, so the train has left the station. It's funny because I thought, well, I've read novels my entire life. I thought I had a sense of how they were constructed and, how to do them. And I started writing and realized I knew nothing. So it was a long process of trying to figure out all kinds of things, like how to format the book and which parts of the stories to tell and at what point they would fit best into the narrative. And so, I'm hoping that by the time I get to my next book, I will have a better sense of how to create distinct characters. I'm sort of toying with something that's set in Kentucky in the 1930s and 1940s, so already I've got an advantage in that I speak the same language as the characters. But it's tricky, and I'm not sure I can even explain how that all evolved.
Well, I think it's a process, right? As we write more and do more, we get, we develop those sort of things,
Right.
and start to understand them. You usually don't understand something until you've done it, and then you look back at it and you sort of start seeing things.
Yeah.
Or understanding it, especially when you go to write the next book.
Yeah, that's my hope.
Well, it's generally what happens.
Yeah.
That's what I find, and then you start using things you've learned. I think so. Now, you mentioned. So, how would you classify this book? Like, if someone was looking at the book, what would you tell them it is?
I guess I generally describe it as literary historical fiction. I don't a reader of lesbian romances. I know there's a huge market for that. It's extremely popular, but I'm wary of anyone describing this book as that, because I think anyone who's expecting the kind of format of a lesbian historical novel, of a lesbian romance, would not be happy finding themselves reading my book, because it's very, very different from that. I think.
Well, what is that? Like, I mean, because I don't know. I've never read a lesbian romance. I don't read male romance either. I just don't read romance.
Right,
right. It's just not, I don't know. I've never been intrigued enough to get into it. If there's a story I'm reading, or if there's something I'm going through, and there's a romance in the story, that's fine, but I'm not looking for that as the main target when I buy a book. So, what's different about a lesbian romance? Is it that there's more challenge to it, or?
No, I think a lesbian romance are basically, they used to be like dime books at the drugstore that you'd pick up. It's a lot of stuff about sex and drama, about getting together and breaking up, and from what I understand, it's pretty formulaic. But again, I haven't read enough of it to be able to characterize it well.
So the girls in your book don't throw beer at each other?
No. there definitely is some drama, but and there's romance, but no beer.
No beer thrown. So it's calm. Well, I just it's kind of a I'm always. What do you think about the LBGT and the categories of writing and stuff like that? Do you read a lot in that category, or just stay away from it?
I think when I was first coming out, there was so little of it that I just read anything I could get my hands on. And so everything from The Well of Loneliness to Rita Mae Brown, but now there are many more choices, and so I tend to lean towards books that are more literary, that have a little more substance to them.
Yeah, well, yeah, you're looking for a little bit of meaning outside of just the romance. So nobody's going to get sex in your books.
There is a little bit of sex.
Okay.
Not a ton.
Not a ton.
My wife used to joke that, if it wasn't a lesbian novel unless the phrase undulating hips came up. So I knew for sure there would be no reference to undulating hips, but that was tricky too, because they didn't have a language for any of this. There weren't books that they could read about this. They had to just kind of make it up as they went along, and so that was challenging to try to figure out how to describe their feelings for one another and their physical relationship. It was a delicate balance.
Yeah, I imagine it would be, and you do want to make sure you kind of get it right. You don't want to do too much fiction in certain areas, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
Well, you'd have to be careful, right? Do you have favorite readers or writers that you like to read, and do you have favorite or movie makers? Like, where do you get some sort of thrill out of certain writers?
Yeah, now as soon as you say that, I'm like, I can't think of the name of a single writer.
Well, I'll tell you, whenever you're on a show with writers and they say, do you know any writers or people that inspire you. Just name the hosts.
Yeah.
You see, then you can never go wrong. You say, well, I really like your books, and then it's, I'm telling you, I've learned that a long time ago.
Yeah.
No, but okay, let's do this. Like, so what do you do for your own entertainment as far as literature or movie watching or series? Do you watch dramas or fiction, nonfiction, horror? Like, what do you like to sit down and read and watch?
In terms of TV and movies, I tend to lean more toward comedies just because there's so much serious stuff going on in the world. I like to get a little break from it. But that's not to say that I don't watch, things that are sad or challenging. But I do tend to lean towards comedy when I'm looking at stuff to watch. In terms of reading, I read pretty widely. I don't read a ton of nonfiction, although at the moment I'm reading a memoir. And in terms of fiction reading, I read a lot of all different kinds of authors. I mean, I like Anne Patchett a lot. There's an author from England named Rose Tremaine. She was, a couple of her books really inspired me, actually. And I'm trying to think who else. Some fun books that I've been reading lately are by an author named Ellen Meister. And in two of the books, she has this premise that Dorothy Parker has not gone toward the light and remains at the Algonquin Hotel as a ghost. And they're very entertaining. You get a lot of that Dorothy Parker wit in the books. But then she also has a number of other books, and they're fun. They're smart and fun. So that's, some of the lighter reading that I do. But, I read a lot of historical fiction. Washington Black, I thought was amazing. Author's name now. But that was about a slave boy who gets taken under the wing of a scientist. I read.
I hear Al Warren's really good.
Yeah. I heard that too.
Yeah, me too. I was wondering, with your poetry, you were talking about how writing bad poetry in high school. And I did the same thing. I just never, kept up with it.
Got better.
I never got better. I never got better. I was kind of reading, James Douglas Morrison, Jim Morrison from The Doors, and then romanticizing myself a poet, which I never really was. But I was just wondering, when I wrote stuff like that, I just kind of, I would also romanticize it kind of like jazz. I would just kind of write it as I felt it. And I'm just wondering how, if you structure your poems, if there's a type of structure that you use, or if it's more just going by feel.
Yeah, it's definitely more by feel. Owing to the fact that I don't have a formal education in poetry, I never really learned the kind of classic formats like sonnets and villanelles and all of that. So, and I audited a class on that once at the University of Chicago, and discovered that I have absolutely no ear for hearing meter. It just seems completely arbitrary to me. So I gave up pretty quickly on the idea that I was going to write any kind of poems that had meter. I tend to be drawn more to poems that have a narrative focus, though sometimes poems that are, completely, like I don't understand really what the author is saying, but they're beautiful in some way anyway. That does happen occasionally, but I do tend to like things that have a more more narrative focus and is lyrical in some way. I'm really drawn to similes and metaphors and trying to take abstract things and make them concrete, put them in words that other people can identify with more easily. So that's kind of how I work with that.
Makes sense.
I wonder, so do you find that, because you said you published way back in 1990, and I just wonder, times were quite a bit different in the 90s. It seemed much happier in general, and in going more the right direction, especially for gays and lesbians. But so did you find your writing to be, let's say, happier, perkier, or your mood to be that way? So therefore, it was more of a positive direction you were writing in, let's say, than it is now? Or how do you find it?
That's an interesting question. I think because in my first book I was focusing a fair amount on some things from childhood, from my family, and also relationships, which I was not doing well with early on in life.
You were throwing too much beer.
Yeah, exactly. The first book is actually, in some ways, darker. Although, in my current book, still, there's pretty much nothing that is taboo for me. I mean, I write about nature. I write about my niece and nephew. I write about my relationship with my wife, and some of it is very sad. There are poems in there. I lost my mom when I was 24, and I've written a bunch of poems about her over the years, and they're often sad. Not all of them. Some of them are about happy things in our life before she died. But yeah, so it's a mix, and I'm not good at political poems. I find I get too didactic, and it just ends up being blah. I mean, I've written a few. I had one published recently, not in the book, called "This Is Not My Story." I don't know if you saw the footage of that little boy who was left in the desert by a group of people traveling from Mexico, and was found by an off-duty police officer, and the footage of him sobbing, scared out of his mind, just really got to me. And so, that's one of the few times when I got a little bit political, but it's on a more human level and not big ideas.
When you've written something darker or sadder, when you're finished a work like that, do you feel you need to decompress? And if so, how do you do that? Or can you just move on to the next thing?
For me, part of the writing process helps me deal with whatever the issues are. I think it helps me bring into focus what I'm really feeling, and it kind of gives me a place to put those feelings, and then I can move on. Obviously, over the decades since my mom has died, I don't feel her death in the same kind of intense way I did back then, but she still occupies an important part in my thoughts and in my poetry. It just, sometimes I know exactly what I want to write about, and then I have to figure out why I want to write about that, and what the poem is going to contain. And other times things are just kind of like phrases will pop into my head and I'll go with that. Or most often when I start a poem, I don't know how it's going to end. That's part of the fun of it for me, is seeing how the poem develops.
Do you like poetry better than the stories, the fiction, or what's kind of been your favorite thing to do?
I think poetry, even though I probably read these days more fiction than I do poetry, I still try to read a lot. Poetry is closer to my heart in some ways. It's really gotten me through a lot, and the language is so much crisper, I think, than writing fiction. Howard Nemeroff, the poet, said that writing a novel is a marriage and writing poetry is an affair. So part of what I like about poetry is I can do it relatively quickly and carry it around with me. In fiction, it's a much longer, slower process. So there's kind of a high that comes with completing a poem and feeling like I did a good job.
I guess the connection is different. Like, do you feel a connection to your characters when you're writing the book, or once you've completed the book? Like with Infraction, do you sort of look back and feel some sort of, I don't know, connection, or do you feel like your characters were like friends or family? Do you have anything like that going on?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel very emotionally involved with them. I just find them fascinating. And, that sounds conceited because I wrote it, but they turned into really interesting people as I went along, and they became more real to me.
A lot of writers say that. So, fiction writers. I'm not one. I do nonfiction. So but I hear that a lot. To me, it sounds kind of nutty, but that's because.
Well, there you go.
Well, yeah, that's just where I'm from. I always just kind of go, well, okay. I don't have any relationship with fictional characters. I don't get it. So that's why I always kind of ask that. Do you I wonder too, for so some of the smaller characters, or people that are, let's say, fillers in the book, or they're just there for whatever reason, short roles. Do you get those from people you know? Do you go out to coffee shop and see someone and someone's personality and kind of go, oh, that kind of person would fit? Or I know J.D. Horn says that if someone that's in a lineup or someone cuts them off or something, or is rude to him in a store, he always takes that character and uses them and kills them off. And I find that really fun. So, but did you get that creative in that sort of process, or is it just not at all?
I think, I don't know, maybe this is a lack on my part, but translating from modern day people and how they act to these more genteel sorts, it wasn't an easy equation for me. I tend not to see people that I know in the position of the characters in the book. I'm not, it's kind of a mystery to me. I don't really know how they developed the way they did, to some extent. Like, I'm thinking about the subplot with the gay male character. I'm not quite sure how I figured out what his personality was. It just kind of evolved.
I just want to make sure you weren't going to use me and maybe have me run over by a herd of horses
I don't
or something, right? Yeah,
The next book.
the next book. I'm the guy that's being ripped apart by horses. It's like, well, thank you. No, and I think it's important. You're right, because when you do a timepiece, you've got to, one of the things that bothers me the most is when I see something or read something and it's supposed to be a timepiece and they're speaking like it's 2021.
Yeah, that was something I was very careful with. I wanted to make sure I didn't have them saying anything like okay and
Sorry for your loss. That one drives me nuts. It's such a common thing now, or thank you for your service, and it's like, and then all of a sudden they're saying it in 1923. It's like, no, that's just, come on.
One of the things I had fun with in the book was there are a ton of Russian proverbs and sayings that some of them are similar to sayings that we have, and others are just like so unusual. I had a lot of fun working those into the book, and that helped to give the flavor of the time and place, I think. That's a really good method. Excellent. Do you put yourself in the characters then? Do you put some of your own? Do you see yourself in any of them? How's that? I certainly didn't do any of that intentionally. I guess to some extent, I see in Marya, we share the same passion for literature and learning, but our personalities are very different. I'm probably more like Vera in that I'm kind of, I don't know how else to say it. I was going to say softer, but, just kind of more easygoing, I guess. Although I guess I'm not really easygoing. I'm pretty high-strung, but...
Well, I was going to say, maybe you have a multi-personality disorder or something.
Yeah.
Depends on the day and everything like that, right? So now, do you yourself have a website, or do you have a place that you like your readers or fans to come find you at?
I do have a website. It is just Yvonne -Zipter.com, and I owe the genesis of that to the publisher of my poetry book, who insists that all of her writers have their own website. And I had one years ago, but it was too complicated for me to keep up. Somebody else had designed it for me and was putting in the information. And then when she stopped doing that, she's a friend who, had her own life, I let go of the website because I didn't know how to fix it. But now there are a lot of web forms that are much easier to use. And I, in fact, just updated it yesterday with a new photograph that I put in. So, that's a good place to go to find out about my books, poems that are published online. I have a project that's kind of unusual and gets a lot of attention, which is because I love poetry so much. I want other people to love it, and I always felt like people are afraid of poetry, but if they were encountering it in kind of a fun way, maybe they'd be more open to it. I have 2 what are repurposed toy vending machines, one at a local brew pub, cider house and brew pub, and one at Women and Children First Bookstore. And it vends 2-inch capsules, each with a published poem of mine in it. They sell for 50 cents, and I use the money, I give the proceeds to a local arts group called Arts Alive Chicago, and they use it for painting supplies and whatnot. So I thought that would be like a short-term thing, that people would get bored with it, but it's been years now, and people seem to really enjoy the excitement of getting a poem dropped into their palm. So there's information about that on the website as well.
Wow, that's interesting. I've never heard of that kind of. That's a great thought. That's good. Good thought. So what are you working on next? What comes out for Yvonne Zipter next?
I was going to start on this new novel, and then last year I had a very tumultuous health year. Oh. I'm actually, let me give you the brief synopsis of that so that I can talk about what I'm working on. But I wound up in the ER at the end of June last year with severe abdominal pain, which turned out to be referred pain from a partially collapsed lung. And while they were trying to diagnose that, they found that I had ovarian cancer. So after they pumped the gunk out of my lung, I got to recuperate for about a month, and then I went to go have surgery and then undergo chemo. So along the way, I've met some very interesting people, a lot of really amazing nurses and doctors, and then some very weird, goofy technicians. And my wife and I like to entertain my oncologist with stories about these technicians and make her laugh. And we were doing that at one appointment. He said, you should write a memoir. And I thought that was a pretty good idea because it was a very, very haphazard the way all of this happened. I mean, if it hadn't been for the fact that I had a partially collapsed lung from pneumonia, and by the way, it was the first symptom I had that anything was wrong. I had no problems with breathing or fever or any of that. If it hadn't been for that, they wouldn't have found the cancer. And, who knows how long it would have taken before that came to light. So I just feel very lucky to have gone through all of that as well as I did.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing, and I hope you're doing better now. Things are better for you.
Yeah, the last the CT scan and a blood test have shown no evidence of disease. So it was a very early stage. It was barely stage 2, which is also unusual for ovarian cancer because the symptoms are so diffuse. It often doesn't get diagnosed until much later along, and then it gets harder to treat. But my oncologist had this great metaphor. She said in the surgery, the surgeon got rid of everything, but they still wanted to do chemo because she said, it's like if you're eating a sandwich on a plate and you don't get any crumbs on the plate when you're done, you still wash the plate. And so that's kind of what they were thinking of with the chemo, is that would, it was just kind of an extra insurance and to catch any little microscopic things that the surgeon might have missed. So, I just, like I said, I feel lucky. And I did not have the problems with chemo that other people had. I'm getting my hair back now, so that's very exciting.
How do you do that? I've lost mine, but I can't. Mine's not coming back. There's got to be a reason, right?
Yeah.
Oh, it's terrible. Well, it's certainly been great, and of course, people can go to your publisher for this book, Rattling Good Yarns, and pick up Infraction as well. Certainly been interesting talking to you, and we certainly learned a lot. If you write poetry, you like having affairs, and do not throw beer in other people's face. You never can get a good long-term relationship that way. I mean, So, well, our guest is
to provide you with all this good information.
I know. I mean, I love it when you have fun and learn something too, right? It's just, I come out of it a better person, But our guest has been the author of the new book called Infraction. Yvonne Zipter, thank you for being here.
My pleasure, and I still feel that way, even at the end of the interview. So thank you to both of you. I really enjoyed it. It was a very thoughtful interview.
Thanks, Yvonne.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
The mission has been completed.
The end! By George, he's got it! It is the end! I'll say it.
If you're lying to me, I'll be back.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.